Hello, students. In this video, we will be beginning Chapter 4, Social Emotional Development in Infancy. There are three major topics, and I will have one video for each of these three topics. The first one, this video, will explore emotional and personality development. The second video will look at social orientation and social understanding and mainly attachment. And finally, the third video will look at social contexts. So to begin looking at emotional and personality development, let me go over the three major topics we'll be covering. Emotional development, we'll talk about some basic emotions and some secondary emotions and how they develop and what's the difference between them. And we'll explore some individual emotions as well and how they progress and develop throughout infancy and toddlerhood. Then we'll look at temperament and finally personality development. So let's begin emotional development by looking at emotions. And as you can see here, we have a definition that is presented in our book, saying that an emotion is a feeling or affect that occurs when a person is in a state or interaction that is important to the self and well-being. And I like this definition, but I don't know if it applies to all emotions. I mean, if you think about some of the negative emotions, like frustration or anger or jealousy or I don't know, sorrow or sadness. I mean, I would say all the definition applies very well to them because it says here a person is in a state or interaction that's important to who they are, to their self, to their well-being. I mean, if something's not important, you don't really feel an emotion, one of these negative emotions. I mean, I don't get angry about something that's not important. I don't feel frustrated if it's not an important goal I'm trying to achieve, or I don't feel great sadness or sorrow, if there's nothing important that's been lost. So I like this for negative emotions. I do believe that deep emotions, well, actually, deep emotions of all types, it has to be important to yourself. But for some of the positive emotions, I can feel pretty happy sometimes without it being really important. I mean, for certainly positive emotions, like particularly, some surface happiness or joy at watching a funny movie, or I don't know, laughing with some friends. It's not necessarily that important to me, but for I would say for once again for deep emotions like deep joy, it would have to be important. The birth of a child, for instance, or being with a loved one, and I can see how for the deeper emotions this definition fits fairly well. Um, okay, emotions are characterized by behavior that reflects the pleasantness or unpleasantness of the state a person is in or the transactions being experienced. So certainly, emotions we know are positive or negative, they're pleasant or unpleasant. Um, it's okay. Let's just keep going. They play an important role in communication with others. Particularly think about infants and toddlers. I mean, their emotions are before they have language. I mean, the emotions are really critical for them to communicate with their caregiver. So the caregiver, takes cues from the emotions that the infant displays. Um, Let me go to the next slide. So emotions influence infants' social responses and adaptive behaviors as they interact with others. So how they feel influences how they behave, is what that's saying. And as I already mentioned, they communicate to others through their emotions. You get a sense of what your baby wants or what they're experiencing based on their emotions. So it's a communication device. Emotions have biological, cognitive, and environmental influences. Um, let's start with some just looking a little bit at the biological influences. I mean, we know that there are particular brain regions involved in the development of emotions. Um, so some of the early developing regions in an infant, such as their brain stem, their hippocampus, their amygdala, these all play a role in the distress, excitement, or even rage that can be seen in infants. I mean, these are very early developing regions, and they allow an infant very early in life to show these emotions, to show distress, to show excitement. Or once again, even infants are characterized as showing rage at times, like severe anger, because of these early developing brain regions, it allows them to communicate these states. Cognitive processes influence infants and children's emotional development, and children learn cognitive strategies to control their emotions and emotional arousal. So as the frontal regions of the cerebral cortex mature, infants gradually develop abilities to control and regulate their emotions. But that takes time, right? It is a gradual process because the frontal regions of the brain aren't developing as quick as those ones I mentioned earlier, the brainstem, the hippocampus, the amygdala. Those are developing first, and then as the frontal regions develop, they allow the infant, and then later on the child, and later the adolescent to gain more and more control over how they regulate their emotions. Okay. Let me just skip down to the bottom here in the social relationships. Um, Relationships and culture do provide a diversity in emotional experiences, as it says here, meaning that there are display rules that develop in each culture that help to determine the range of emotional experiences that children in that culture will show. So, like, just to give you a concrete example, I mean, in the U.S. here, we value emotional expression in our children, and so our children from a very young age show great emotional expression. When they're happy, they shout it out, and when they're upset, they throw tantrums or yell or cry. And whereas in some other cultures, they have a much more narrow expression of emotions because it's not valued as much. So in a culture such as China, for instance, they really respect their children to be more controlled and to regulate their emotions. It's part of the display rules of the culture that you don't wear your emotions on your sleeve. And so from an earlier age, we see differences between the two cultures. Young Chinese children control their emotions much more, and they show less variability in their emotions. It doesn't mean that they don't feel them as much, but they've learned to display them differently. So culture does help to determine, how much and when we display our emotions. Okay, we're going to talk about two major types of emotions. The first are the primary emotions, and primary emotions are also known as basic emotions. They're present in humans and other animals early in life. They're expressed in the first 6 months of life in a human. These basic emotions include the emotions of surprise, interest, joy, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. All of those emotions I just listed, those 7 emotions, can be seen in the first half year of life. We can see some pictures here of infants expressing joy, sadness, fear, surprise at a very young age. And so these early primary emotions are innate emotions. They're not learned by being amongst other humans. They're These infants are born with these primary emotions. However, the second class of emotions, the self-conscious emotions, they require self-awareness, especially a consciousness and a sense of individuality, a sense of me, as it says here. So these don't develop until after the first year of life. These are emotions such as jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, guilt. These emotions require thought and they require a sense of self because they are either enhancements or, you know, uh, I don't know, decrements or insults to the sense of self. So pride is an enhancement of your sense of self. Whereas embarrassment or I don't know, shame or guilt, they are like injuries to your sense of self. So you need that sense of self, that feeling that you are an individual before you can possibly experience these self-conscious emotions. You have to have a sense of self. These are also known, by the way, as other conscious emotions. So in one way, they're self-conscious. You have to be aware of yourself, but there are also other conscious emotions. We call them other conscious emotions because they involve emotions as a reflection of being around other people. So like you feel shame because in front of somebody that you were, such as a parent when you were a young child. You feel guilt because you did something that might have harmed somebody else. Or, you don't necessarily feel these emotions as deeply just on your own, but they often require a sense of another, as well as a sense of self. But it's like you feel pride because of how your parents look upon you or your older sibling looks upon you. And so this is why they're also known as other conscious emotions. They kind of reflect how you think others are viewing you at the time. Oh, my parents are proud of me, or my parents are mad at me, and so I feel guilt. Or you feel empathy towards another person. You feel embarrassment in front of another person. Okay. So once again, two very different types of emotions. The primary emotions you have from birth, they develop, you know, or if they don't not showing up right from birth in the first half year of life, the other emotions not till sometime in the second year of life do they show up. The self-conscious emotions, they're much more complex. They're taught. We actually teach our infants and our toddlers, how and when to feel these emotions. We're not born with them. We say things like, "You should be ashamed of yourself. You should be embarrassed for what you did. Oh, you should be so proud of yourself." We tell them when to feel these emotions. They're learned emotions. So very two different classes. Okay, I'm not going to get into these different types of cry. You can read about them in the book on your own. It's pretty straightforward. I'll mention a couple of other details not listed here about crying. We consider it the most important mechanism for a newborn to communicate with the world. I mean, really, it's their first major form of communication. They cry to get your attention. The first cry that a baby does verifies that their lungs are filled with air, so it's very important. It provides information about the health of a newborn's central nervous system. When they cry, it tells us that their central nervous system is working. They're responding to the environment. Um, um, okay, that's enough there. Let's go on and we'll look at smiling a little bit here. Uh, an infant develops a reflexive smile, usually it appears during the first month after birth. Um, and most times it's while they're sleeping. It's not in response to external stimuli, which is why it may happen just while they're sleeping. So when you see a, a baby, in the first month of life smiling, they're not really smiling at you. It may feel like it, you may think they are, but they're just feeling pleasant. Sometimes because they just ate, that might cause them to smile. Sometimes just having gas makes them smile. Um, so they're not really smiling in response to the environment at that point. They're responding to their internal feelings and stimuli. The social smile, though, is in response to external stimuli. And the social smile begins as early as about 2 months of age. So first month, we got reflexive smile, maybe up to 2 months. Sometime around the 2-month mark, you start to see the social smiles come in. And typically the first ones are in response to a face. And so they are smiling back at you. So if they're 2 months or older and you smile at them and they smile back, yeah, they are responding to you. So they quickly develop that social smile. Okay, fear. There's a couple of ways that fear is demonstrated during the infancy stage. The first way is stranger anxiety. We've all heard of this. It's a fear of strangers. It appears, as it says here, during the second half of the first year of life. So starting after 6 months, and then it escalates until about a year and a half, 18 months, where it kind of peaks and then it declines. Infants are less fearful of child strangers compared to adult strangers. I guess the diminished size makes them more appealing. And they show less stranger anxiety in familiar settings. If you want your babies to meet a stranger and you want them to be cool with it, you should do it in your home, where the baby spends most of their time. The more familiar the surroundings and the settings, the more likely they are to show a positive response to a stranger. Another way they demonstrate fear, infants, is separation protest. This is, of course, the distress they show when you leave them. So you separate from your infant. So, for instance, you drop them at a childcare or daycare center. This peaks around 15 months for U.S. infants. So, just a little over a year and 3 months is when we tend to see it maximize. And then once again, it starts to decline a little bit after that. Okay. Emotional regulation and coping, a very important skill, is to control emotions. And in fact, when I say it's important, I mean, there's been a lot of research done that just shows that infants, toddlers, and preschoolers that have a better ability to regulate their emotions tend to do better throughout their development. They tend to do better at school. They tend to do better socially. And it makes sense if you think about it. If you're good at controlling your emotions and you don't fly off the handle, and you can suppress anger when you need to. I mean, you will do better with other people, and you'll be more likable. Infants develop, they have a limited ability, but they can inhibit or minimize, as it says here, the intensity and duration of emotional reactions with a few simple techniques. Initially, they'll put their thumb in their mouth, which is soothing to them. This will appear very early in infancy, and a lot of times when they are sucking on their thumbs, it is in order to make themselves feel better. And later in infancy, they learn to redirect their attention. That may be as simply as turning their head the other way when they're laying in the crib. So if there's some turmoil, such as the parents fighting, they may turn their head away. And this has been demonstrated before in observational studies. They also may distract themselves. So sometimes an infant will do something to distract themselves, which could include sucking on their thumb, as going back to that earlier behavior, or if they have a toy or a blanket to cling to, they may do that. After language eventually develops, they will often start to use language to control their emotions. So they'll talk to themselves to help to regulate their emotions, or they may talk to others. Okay. I'm going to skip the middle section there. Going down to the bottom, infants with negative temperaments have fewer regulation strategies. Okay, so infants with negative temperaments have fewer regulation strategies. Of what is temperament? Well, that is our next topic, and we will start by looking at the results from the Chess and Thomas landmark study. This was a study that Chess and Thomas conducted in the late 1970s. It was known as the New York longitudinal study. So what they did is they started with infants, newborns, and that were enrolled in the study, and they observed them and classified them according to different temperamental categories. And then it was a longitudinal study, so they continued to check back in with them throughout their childhood, adolescence, and even into adult years to see, whether or not their temperaments changed from early in infancy to later in childhood, to adolescence, to adulthood. They wanted to see how stable temperament was. And so their initial classification, well, actually, I should define temperament first. As it says here, individual differences in behavioral styles, emotions, and characteristic ways of responding. So it's the easiest way to think of it is, what's your general mood like? This will include things like, do you have regular routines? Are you fussy in new situations, or are you easygoing? And how do you respond to new stimuli or new people? So based on their behaviors, their emotions, and the way they respond to stimuli, they classified them into three categories. The first one are easy children. They're generally in a positive mood. They have regular routines in infancy. And the routines they mainly looked at was like eating routines and sleeping routines, and and the easy children adapt to new experience as well. This category was made up of 40% of their subjects. Difficult children react negatively. They cry frequently and throw tantrums. They have irregular daily routines of sleeping and eating, so they wake up more during the night, for instance. They're slow to accept change. They don't like new things, and they react, with tantrums or crying or yelling. They're difficult. This was 10% of their sample fit this category. And finally, the slow to warm up children have generally a low activity level. They're not going around, in a positive mood, and like the easy children. They're not as outgoing as easy children are. They tend to be more subdued, relaxed, but they're not, at the same time, they're not showing the negative reactions of the difficult child. Overall, their mood tends to be somewhat negative, but it's not explosive. It's a lower intensity of mood. And so when presented with new stimuli or new people, they kind of initially seem like a difficult child, but they are called slow to warm up because they will, kind of become more and more like an easy child over time. So it just takes them a little while for them to warm up to any kind of new people or new stimuli. But once again, they don't have the explosive negativity of the difficult child, and they're not as positive and outgoing as the easy children. So they're kind of a middle class between the two. They're 15% of the subjects were in this category. So 40% in easy children, 10%, of difficult children, 15% slow to warm up. If you add these up, it only comes up to 65%. Because 35%, about a third of their sample, did not fit easily into any of these categories. So they remained unclassified. What they found in their study, as they observed these children, move into later childhood and adolescence and eventually adulthood, is that they found that temperament is moderately stable across childhood. That is that generally speaking, if nothing changes, an easy infant becomes an easy child. And generally speaking, they'll become an easier adolescent as well. And a difficult infant becomes a difficult child generally. Slow to warm up, they may, they may end up moving a little bit towards ease, being more or less easy or difficult, but they generally remain in the same category as well. So most of their subjects, the subjects would tend to remain in the same categories unless there was major changes in their environment. So perhaps a parenting situation changed somehow, or I don't know, could be something like a new sibling coming into the household that might disrupt their temperament. So, but this was the important thing was that we did find that because that temperament was somewhat stable, moderately stable. So, well, what this meant was that even though the environment changed, for many of the subjects, their temperament remained the same because it must be that there's a biological contributor to temperament. And this is what the research led them to believe. It stays the same. It doesn't vary week to week or month to month or year to year as their life changes in this child. But sorry, can't talk. Okay, but it tends to remain the same. So it must have a biological basis to it. And this is what they discovered, that we are born with a certain temperament, and we tend to, maintain that temperament. And once again, unless there are radical changes in our lives. Okay. There are two other types of classification systems for looking at temperament. I want you to read these on your own in the book. The Kagan's behavioral inhibition idea, Rothbard and Bates classification, which kind of looks at introversion and extroversion. So I was just talking about how temperament has biological foundations and influences. So our contemporary view is that temperament is a biologically based trait, but it is evolving. It's an evolving aspect. It can change. It will be modified over time, but it is originally based in biology. Okay. As far as gender, culture, and temperament, we do know that there are some environmental influences, such as parents responding to infants depending on their gender. So little boy babies tend to be brought up differently than little girl babies. We're much more, for instance, we're much more responsive to the crying of irritable girls versus irritable boys, which is helpful for the girls, that we do respond to them more easily. So a girl with a difficult temperament will be responded to, and in this positive response may soften the difficult temperament over time. Whereas we tend to be less responsive to boys, which means that there's less chance that a difficult boy will lose their difficult nature. So how we respond to the babies helps to influence, whether or not their temperaments may adjust or change over time. And we do it differently depending on the gender. Culture determines how we react to children as well. I already mentioned earlier that the U.S. values a very active temperament. China values more behavioral inhibition, being more reserved. And also a very important characteristic of temperament is, or not characteristic, but an important, aspect, let's just say, of temperament, is that what's important really is what we call a goodness of fit between an infant's temperament and how they are raised. Or a child's temperament and how they are raised. Just to give you an example, it's not good to make an active child sit still for long periods. They're not meant for that. Whereas, so a very active, outgoing, easygoing, easy temperament child, they may they may not be good at sitting still. Whereas a more inhibited or reserved temperament child, you know, can remain in one place for much longer. So how we treat them, for instance, asking them to stay still or to stay in one place, it depends. The results will depend on their initial temperament, how successful they are doing that. So we should have different expectations for our children. Pushing a slow to warm up child into new situations is not good. For instance, they're slow to warm up. They need patience. They need to be gradually introduced into things. If you push them into things that are new, they find it very uncomfortable, and they will react negatively to that. Some children can be pushed into new things. Children that have more of an outgoing nature, and easygoing children tend to be that way much more. Okay, so anyway, so there are things that you can do that will work for one child, but they may not work for another child. And this is the idea of goodness of fit. Tailoring your parenting strategies or your caregiving strategies to the child's temperament. Okay. Just a little bit more in this first section. Personality development. First of all, trust. We're going to go back to Erik Erikson's theory that we looked at in the first chapter. Remember, he's got 8 different lifespan crises that you face, at different points of the lifespan. The first one was trust. We went over this in chapter 1. It's from 0 to 1 year of age, so the first year of life. And according to Erikson, this is characterized by the crisis of trust versus mistrust. We talked about in the first chapter a little bit that if you are well cared for by a sensitive caregiver, you're fed when you're hungry, you're picked up and soothed when you're upset and crying, you're changed when you're wet, then you develop a sense of trust. You feel that the world is a trustworthy place, that you can trust others. However, if you go hungry for long periods without being responded to, and you cry without being responded to, and you're treated harshly at times, you will feel like the world is untrustworthy, and you will develop mistrust towards others. And according to Erikson, this will be carried as part of your personality going forth. Erikson's recommendation for caregivers was that you should always pick up and soothe a crying infant, so that in order to develop a healthy sense of trust. Do not play games with infants. Do not say, okay, I'm going to let them cry for 2 minutes or 5 minutes before I go to them. This has been recommended before in certain publications in the past, but our current understanding is that Erikson was correct in this, that you'll get a healthier infant if you go to them whenever they cry. They are not just crying to mess with you. They're not playing games with you, so you shouldn't play games with them. You go to the infant, you pick them up, you soothe them. They end up becoming attached to you. They trust you. They trust the world. Okay. I'm going to skip down to independence here. Erikson's second stage, while I'm on him, is autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is from 1 to 3 years of age. So autonomy means independence. And basically, after leaving the first year of life when they had to depend on others, a child now can start to do things for themselves, feeding themselves, putting their own clothes on, using the potty, for instance. And if they're successful and they're in doing these things, they start to feel like they have a sense of independence or autonomy. In order to help with this, parents should be patient and allow the child to do things on their own, even if they fail sometimes. Don't always rush in right away to do it for them. or to help them, let them try things on their own. And because when they succeed, they are overjoyed and they feel like they are autonomous and independent and have a sense of being able to do things. The shame and doubt tends to be promoted when parents are harsh, whenever children try to do things on their own and they fail. And if the parent is too critical and harsh towards the child ends up feeling like they can't do anything for themselves, and they feel a sense of shame whenever they try and fail. Our final bit of in this section is developing sense of self. In the middle here, it develops by 18 months of age. A self-recognition, at least, developed by 18 months of age. We know this from doing a mirror test, and the way this test is done is that researchers have mothers put a little red dot on the noses of babies, or other on their noses or their forehead sometimes. It's called the rouge test. Rouge meaning red. And they have them then, they place them in front of a mirror. And if the child touches their own nose or their own forehead when they see the red dot, it means that they know that they're looking at themselves in the mirror. And and this would signify that they have self-recognition. If, however, they touch the mirror, they try to touch the child in the mirror, or some children might even walk around a mirror, or they try to get to the other side of the mirror because they think a kid's behind it, or then it shows that they're not recognizing themselves. We can see in these studies here, there's a couple of studies listed. I'm not going to get into the specifics of them, but we can see this self-recognition really developing by about 2 years of age in the majority of subjects. Starting sometime around 15 to 18 months, around a year and a half, and then becoming more fully developed by 2 years. And that concludes the first section of chapter 4.